We've been talking all morning about this first anniversary of the BP oil spill and the impact that it's had on the Gulf Coast. CBS News correspondent and resident veterinarian Dr. Debbie Turner-Bell recently spent some time in the Gulf to see how the animals are doing there 1 year later. Good morning, Debbie.
Good morning to you, Chris. Well, the Gulf of Mexico is one of the country's most important habitats for birds. More than 300 species live or pass through the Gulf. In fact, there are 34 federally protected species that call the Gulf home. So, when the oil polluted this fragile ecosystem, many experts feared that the wildlife might never fully recover. And on this first anniversary, there is some good news and some not so good news.
These images showed the devastation that the largest oil spill in U.S. history wreaked on the wildlife in the Gulf of Mexico last year. Today, this is what the pelican's original home in Louisiana looks and sounds like. Air cannons in Barataria Bay keep birds away from marshes still soaked in oil. This is state biologist Todd Baker's territory. Does it just drive you crazy that a year later, this still looks this bad?
Well, it's unacceptable that a year later, we're still looking at mobile oil. You're still seeing sheens. You're still seeing crabs and small little animals crawling through this mess.
In numbers, birds top the list of the dead, but experts believe endangered sea turtles may have been hit the hardest.
They looked like they had been dipped in rich chocolate mousse.
It has taken 10 months for these 30 rescued sea turtles to heal from infections and broken bones. They were cared for by veterinarian Dr. Cara Field at the Audubon Nature Institute in New Orleans.
They've really come a long way, and we're very happy with their progress.
Now they are finally ready to be released, but experts are questioning the health of the Gulf after an unusually high spike in dolphin strandings along the coast. Since January, more than 170 have been found dead, nearly half of them babies. This is evidence. Here in these freezers at the Institute for Marine Mammal Studies, thousands of samples await testing by the federal government to determine the exact cause of death. It seems mighty suspicious that in the first calving season after this huge oil spill, you have this high mortality.
So in the public's mind, the connection is there, and that is why it's frustrating that we don't have the results that we should have to be able to mitigate these issues or answer these tough questions.
Cleanup here in Barataria Bay will take years, and it may be even longer before we know just how much damage was done to the Gulf's vital ecosystem. We came upon this injured frigate bird, just rescued, with oil on it.
Whenever they come impaired or whatnot, they seek refuge on the first piece of land they can to get out of the water. This bird found a tar ball field.
It is a heartbreaking reminder that this disaster isn't finished claiming its victims.
And the reality is we may never really know the true death toll. Some experts say it could be 50 times higher than what's reported. However, Chris, experts believe that the Gulf can recover if we as humans are responsible.
Just going to take some time. How much oil did you see in Barataria Bay when you were there?
I was shocked. I actually saw oil oozing up out of the ground. I dug down in it. No matter how deeply I dug, I saw oil. It really was amazing.
Any idea how long it's going to take to find out the cause of death with those dolphins?
Well, the government has put a gag order on the results, and we might not find out until the government's case against BP goes to court, and that could be years from now.
Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. Twilight's the best time to find oil, if you know where to look.
This is weathered oil.
That orange glow, that's oil, highlighted under the ultraviolet light of researcher Ben Dubansky from Louisiana State University.
And that's all oil. Oh, yeah, look at all that.
And on Barataria Bay's northern tip, the dried oil was everywhere, clumped in soft marshland.
I could take you to 100 sites just like this.
Find the same thing.
Sure.
Even today, Louisiana officials spotlighted more oil.
They say that this is acceptable,
hoping to shame BP into continuing its cleanup. Remember last summer? These images stuck like oil. A preventable spill, the worst in history. 4 Gulf state coastlines smeared for months. By last June, the threat was easy to spot.
This is so heavy, I can barely lift it. But 10 months later, whatever oil is left is harder to find, like these tar balls that washed up on this beach. And scientists strongly disagree about the spill's lasting impact on the Gulf.
That river of oil, roughly 200 million gallons. Government scientists estimate 29% of it dispersed. 25% was recovered or burned off in these dramatic pictures we showed you last summer. 23% evaporated or dissolved. leaving 23%, roughly 46 million gallons, that reached shore or stayed in the water.
I don't think we're going to see any massive impacts as we go forward.
Ed Overton's an LSU environmental scientist. He believes the Gulf's recovering faster than expected, from its wildlife to its complex ecosystem. Sunbaked oil left on land will degrade in the next few years, he says, and in deep waters, any remaining oil has fallen below detectable levels.
All we're doing now is postulating. It may be an educated guess, but it's still a guess.
But Samantha Joy is much more pessimistic.
It did look like a graveyard.
Last December, this University of Georgia marine scientist led a deep dive expedition near the runaway well. She's now studying 450 core samples, many of them thick sludge smothering the seafloor.
The people who live on the Gulf Coast know that there's a problem. It's really fallen off the radar, and people aren't thinking about it because they feel like they've been told that everything's fine when it most certainly isn't.
So how bad is it? No one knows for sure because there's never been a spill this massive in an ecosystem so complex and fragile. Everyone agrees on one point: spill anxiety here will last for years to come.
Since the beginning of the year, hundreds of sea turtles and dolphins have washed up dead on the shores of the Gulf Coast. It's not yet clear how many of those deaths are actually connected to the spill, but scientists say it's an unusual and troubling development.
These are the cleaned beaches of Gulf Shores, Alabama. They are regularly maintained to make sure the tourism industry here that was devastated last year can bounce back. But the beaches in Alabama are not all clean, a fact that concerns environmentalist Casey Calloway, who grew up in this area.
We are known for sugar white sand beaches, so fine, so pure, with nothing but shell in there, and not even a whole lot of shell. But what we're seeing now is oil and goo and tar and who knows what else. That's all intermixed and intertwined, not just in the sand, but often right behind the first wave line, right behind the dunes.
Because of the dispersants used during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the oil takes the form of small tar balls. About 35 kilometers to the west of Gulf Shores, we find a beach that is covered in them.
This beach hasn't been deep cleaned, quote unquote, but every day something new washes ashore, so some new layer. And if you just glance at it, you might think it's just pebbles, but what it is, all of these are tar balls.
And here we go. Just mushy, gross.
And you can smell it.
You can smell the hydrocarbons, which means there's still some toxicity to these.
Potentially, yeah.
Tar balls like these will be a presence on the Gulf Coast beaches for decades, but scientists say they are relatively non-toxic. The greater concern is the unknown. After the introduction of so much oil to the Gulf Coast, scientists are still not sure how the ecosystem will respond.
Once you take a system that's going and productive and producing fish, and all of a sudden you say, okay, now you're going to behave like this, there's not a very large amount of time for things to compensate and to deal with new sources of energy and new pathways within food chains. And so you can have a short-term effect actually cascade out into a long-term problem.
A long-term problem that affects so many livelihoods along the Gulf Coast.
Pretty worrying picture there. Well, scientists say it could be years before the full extent of the damage is known. Let's talk more about this with Mayoko Sakashitas, who's from the U.S. Center for Biological Diversity, joining us on the line from San Francisco. Thank you for being on the program tonight. Well, a year on, there are reports that BP oil can still be seen along the Louisiana coastline there. Do you think enough has been done, is still being done to clean up this mess?
Absolutely not. There really needs to be a strong focus on cleanup. And it's pretty remarkable that here, 1 year after the BP oil spill disaster began, there's such a short memory for what's happening there. And already the government is in the habit of saying okay to offshore drilling and are making plans to lease new areas to offshore. Yet, as you said before, many of the impacts of the oil spill are still yet to be seen, and even in its most recent review of this new lease that it's planning on issuing in the Gulf of Mexico, they said, well, we don't really know what the impacts are yet. We're still conducting those studies, but our guess is that they're very little, and so we don't think there's any new information that we need to take into account when doing this analysis. But as you said, it's been very difficult to get information about the impacts.
Miyoko, we all recall those heartbreaking pictures, those poor seabirds, the animals, and listening to the stories of the fishermen, the people living along the coast, those lives absolutely decimated. How bad do you think the damage still really is from the information you've gleaned?
Well, we've heard reports of massive strandings of sea turtles, and that's likely only the ones that have been found. There's probably about 5 times that amount that were injured out of the ocean and are victims and have not washed up onto shore. And there's also been major reports of over 150 baby dolphins that have stranded dead on the shores, and likely that's a vast underestimate of the damages that are out at sea. And correctly, there are still tar balls washing up on the seashores and reports of layers of oil that's still covering the sea floor. Yet much of the information about the assessment that's being done to try to figure out what the damage is has been kept quiet, and it's very difficult to know the exact numbers and know the exact causes. Yet at the same time, as the previous report said, many people are reporting illnesses and feeling sick still, and a lot of people are afraid to buy shellfish or fish from the Gulf of Mexico, which is really harming the communities still also.
Yeah, and as there's full pictures coming out, BP, meantime, just this week trying to shift responsibility for the disaster onto its partners by filing lawsuits against them. They're in turn suing BP. The blame game well underway. Who do you think should be held responsible for what we witnessed?
Well, certainly BP is a responsible party, but I would add, in addition to that, that the U.S. government has played a role in having poor oversight of offshore oil and gas. They've promised regulatory reform to really rein in this industry that's kind of gone wild, and yet at the same time, we're seeing a year later permits going forward with still none of the adequate compliance with environmental laws that the Commission found was some of the problem that led to the BP disaster in the first place. So they really need to change the culture of the U.S. government and start doing the proper analysis and looking at alternatives to offshore oil drilling. That's quite risky.
Well, the organisation you work for is at the forefront of lobbying for change. Your Centre for Biological Diversity indeed has launched a number of lawsuits against the US government, hasn't it? And it's lobbying for reforms, as you're saying, on offshore oil practices. What changes, though, do you think to regulation we should see to prevent similar accidents like this from happening again? Can you ever really safeguard against it?
That's true, and absolutely. An oil spill like the BP disaster could happen again tomorrow, and especially with the poor oversight that's going on. One of the really important reforms is that we saw with the BP disaster, there was a complete waiver of environmental review for that project, and those environmental waivers are still on the books. So that's one obvious place that could certainly use reform. The second area is that there have been vast underestimates of what an oil spill could do. I think for the prior to the BP spill, they said, oh, the most oil that could ever spill into the Gulf of Mexico from all of our offshore leasing over 40 years would be about 30,000 barrels, and we saw that eclipsed in just one day of the BP disaster.
All right, Miyoko Sakashita from the U.S. Center for Biological Diversity in San Francisco. Delighted to have you on the program tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.